Hi everyone, and welcome to the Spring Semester Working Title Faculty and Student Reading Series, which is hosted by English and Humanities at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. It's great to have you all here. I'm Dr. Juli and I'm working with Dr. Chris Williams, who is behind the scenes handling all of the tech elements for tonight's event. Tonight we'll be hearing from four amazing readers. We have Lydia Downey, Sidney, Grady, Dr. Rebecca Meacham, and Rachel Sankey. Before we begin though, I'd like to take a moment to read the Uwgb land acknowledgement. We at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation are the original First People of Wisconsin, and both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides upon. Today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nations communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Forest County Potawatomi, Ojibwe Nation communities, Stockbridge Munsee Band of the Mohicans, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. We acknowledge the First Nations people of Wisconsin. So just to give a quick overview of the night before we get started, we're going to be featuring the readers tonight in alphabetical order. So we'll go Lydia Downey, Sidney Grady, Dr. Rebecca Meacham, and Rachel Sankey. Each one will read for about 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. I think the chat and the Q&A functions will be closed until later in the reading, but once they're open, please feel free to type in any questions that you have for our readers. Because we're using the Teams format, we'd like to rotate through all the readers during the question session. So questions that apply to all readers are particularly welcome, but if you have a burning question for one particular reader, feel free to ask it and we'll do our best to accommodate it. All right, so our first reader tonight is Lydia Downey. Lydia Downey, who uses the pronouns she, her, is a junior at Uwgb, majoring in writing and the applied arts. Lydia specializes in poetry, but also enjoys challenging herself with creative nonfiction. She's the current nonfiction editor and social media coordinator for the Sheepshead Review and is also a Uwgb Creatives intern. Lydia has been recently published in her first literary journal, Vital Sparks, for her poetry. Please welcome Lydia.
Hello. The first piece that I'm going to be reading is an homage to home. The rhythmic curve from my nose followed the stories of women before me. Not a swift swoop, but an abrupt start that trails down the hump to the tip of a continental, a radical dead end. Rounded at the edges, protruding from the side, it whispers kindred spirits. Though metal bars protruded fresh flesh in defiance of landscapes, the foreign territory was not bestowed to the linkage of this lineage. Ancient Americ spewed from the sharp tongue as tiny black hairs trailed down my soft white tummy. How I tried to bend my roots, reshaping this family tree. In defiance of my parents, plucking each brow, I cast away each tear that my ancestors shed underneath the hot Assyrian sun. This heritage is my home. Dark hair trailing down my back, soft eyes underneath full lashes, the curvature of my own femininity. 3 prominent creases on the knuckles of each finger, tangled, intertwining with June. This is a part of me. It could swallow me whole in the whole complexity of each freckle. It could open the floodgates of northern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. It could boast to me in such a way that biblical references cower away from these thorns. It could drown me from Tigris and Zab rivers and crumble underneath the Median Mountains. It doesn't, though, not in that way. It comes from the soft smiles of my grandmother, the full beard of my father, the olive complexion of my sister. It comes from the photos that are tucked neatly in floral boxes underneath blankets and closets. It comes from the family gatherings, the old house in Chicago, the small Oxford shoes placed into the corner of neatly carpeted living rooms. It comes from the china set stowed away in glass cabinets, a lady in a ball gown with children trailing behind. An homage to the home I never stepped foot in, besides for the words spoken from mother to son, God be with you. My next piece is To Bake Bread. Mother tells stories, breaks through perforated cracks like eggshells, cries but slithers in yellow oxidized spheres, seeps in pale blue mixing bowls. She sighs when I need stevia STD screening, calling her on the sheets, said to me, put it on the plastic. Wonder if Dad is ashamed. Bananas are best bruised like egos when beer bottles up emotions, until finally the timer goes off, puts toothpicks inside my skin, calloused falls on fleeting days between nestled hummingbird wings, winds me up when footsteps echo downstairs. I held my breath. Wishful stomach growls, smells it bake in the tension of a particular time when pitter-patter thunderstorms, footsteps down hallways to cocoon in between father and mother, makes me wish that cracked bones on Friday night means good luck. Did you think about when fuck was one of the first words, spilled out like coffee? Grounds me the second time, feels irrelevant, much like mother finding cigarettes in my room. But no head rush can compare to the fear of your face on another person. Feels fake. When do you ever see the orange moon eyes of your lovers? Warms the harsh heat of the gas box, singes off eyebrows, oven mitts pull out and observe this bread best served warm. Thanks. My next one is Pacific Blues in C minor. We observe mountains, cracked sunlit faces streaming, sailing past the blue hues of subtle winds, whispering, dancing above the steamboat that moves along Pacific paradise of my demise. Sirens remind me the orca whales swim next to their calves like stubborn, fragile barnacles, until their sessile, 1,000-ton bodies depart and decompose back into familiar homes, that we reside until treading water feels like second nature. Methodical melodies, small islands drift, like the girl that runs on wooden decks as I ponder if she will return. Know that memories feel as shallow as tidal pools but hold hundreds of living creatures that remain present until darkness creeps, encapsulates those docile, scarce organisms. Hold on, sweet child. Beauty is fragile and we possess none of it. My love letters from Vancouver Island. Thank you. And then my last piece is Cicada Cemetery. Running barefoot, grass-stained feet stepped around pine trees. Picking little bodies off the tree limbs, we placed them in pail buckets, collecting them like cemetery workers. The darkened brown skeletons suctioned onto the bark, fighting to remain docile. The little pop would follow and the little ding into the bucket as we ran around the trees. I was proud to collect so many. Holding their little bodies in the palm of my hands, I placed them on the linoleum and divided cicada shells like math equations. This would be for an old lover, this for an old friend, this for a non-existent parent, but I do not know that yet. These bodies hold truth. As a child, I knew pain. I saw the newly hatched insect climb out of its mold. Flushed green singing gently in the night, I was scared of them. Existing differs from being present. One day I walked closely, seeing it stay still as wasps stung it repeatedly, their daggers piercing its fresh skin. One after another, I walked away, letting it bleed cicada anthems until it could not take the pain anymore. Later in the evening, I retrieved its shell as a souvenir for its fallen life. Cicadas live long, but I lived longer, those trees cut down. This home stands stoic amongst the branches collapsing, poisoned over time. Death does not pick favorites. It forces wasps into the bodies of innocents. It flies my father over cars on country roads. It eats the flesh off my sister on Thanksgiving. It brings comfort to me in a once empty vodka bottle on cheap bathroom tiles at 10 p.m. on Tuesdays. That something so primal, something so unknowing could feel that too. That pain receptors alert tiny bodies as it flaps its wings in defiance of its fragile capacity. I told my mother that I wished it moved. It fought. Though for as small as it was, it knew. It knew that this habitat wouldn't be here long. When it sung, it sang loud. When it buzzed, it perforated my eardrums. Those bodies climbed inside the crevices of my canal and found a place to find peace. So as an adult, I take sertraline for it. Fluoxetine works better. That prickly feeling remains. That sap stains my fingertips, oozes into my bloodstream, tastes like metal, feels tranquil. And when I lay still, I feel those feet dance around pillars of statues, rings around those hard stools, and if I listen, their familiar tune creeps up when I fall back into a state of dormancy. That this body, the one of my mother, father's, sister, hardened of calcium and skin cells and blue and red blood, leave their bodies at night to fly with them. And if I try hard enough, I'm there, moving slowly in the backyard where I meet that creature and grab it. Look it in the eyes and meet me in the cemetery and bury me to the cicada anthem where you wrap your wings around and lift me a little higher and watch me fall down like helicopter wings back to home. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Next, we have Sidney Grady. Sidney Grady is a senior at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, where he is studying English and history. He has been published in Sheepshead Review and loves to explore the distant past and what it means for humans of today through writing. Let's welcome Sidney.
Hello. I'll be reading a piece called Eleutheria today. The bottle of Coke sat there like the Holy Grail, between some unknown banana juice and the unrecognizable can of something supposedly meant to be Fanta on the cooler shelf. I really want a Coke, I said to no one. So get one, came a voice behind me. She sounded irritated, impatient, and I grimaced. I'd been particularly sulky that day, and I knew it. There had been a sort of euphoria to the last couple of weeks. I'd entered a portal back in gray, rainy Chicago and come out 10 hours later in a realm of magic, surrounded by mountains and coastlines and blue waters and the crumbling ruins of a mysterious ancient people dotting the terrain. Greece had been a point of fascination for me for years, the image of it in my mind growing and evolving along with me. As a child, it had been the mystical world of Disney's Hercules. I scarcely recognized it as a real flesh and blood place. I never stopped viewing it through the lens of mythology. It was the land of gods and monsters more than one of humanity to me, even as I learned all I could about the incredible and very real human culture that had developed there, even as I came to realize that there was so much more to it than its ancient roots. It never really seemed real until I stood on its soil, and with the wide eyes of a child still waited for something like Apollo to come down with a beam of sunlight and the strum of a lyre, for some prophetic vision that I belonged here. It did not come so literally, but I would have sworn in the early days that I felt it. As with all highs, however, there came a crash, and that had been approximately 11 hours earlier. This was not the first person in the group to express mild annoyance with me since, and I was beginning to feel bad. I'll be quick, you can go ahead. I scurried into the kiosk, prepared to run back down the street to avoid being abandoned, phoneless, on the pretty tiled streets of Nafplio. She stopped to wait, though, as did the other girls, and I smiled back at them. I'll be quick, I repeated. The kiosk worker peered out of his tiny window when I stepped up, holding out my cold, beautiful bottle of Coke with a grin and a quick, deliberate hello. Most Greeks clocked me as American without so much as a word spoken between us, but I liked to greet them in English regardless. It was a bad habit, one that I told myself I wouldn't develop before I'd even arrived, but the way they usually bent over backwards to be accommodating made it far too easy to rely on that. I knew realistically the desire to communicate comfortably would prevent me from ever letting on that I recalled even a word of Greek. Anna, he said. How much? I asked stupidly, caught off guard by the Greek, though I knew at the very least how to count to 10, and I knew what he was saying. He shook his head and pointed at the bottle. He didn't know what I was saying. Anna, he repeated. Since landing in Greece, I had so rarely come across someone who didn't speak any English. I eventually came to my senses then. 1, duh. I slid him a euro coin and took off. I sipped my Coca-Cola on the walk back to the hotel. I was trying to cut out soda that summer. It was an addiction that I couldn't quite understand, as it didn't make me feel good, but it was a hard habit to break. I should have felt like a failure, but now the familiar, sickly sweet flavor comforted me. It's the only American food I'd had in 2 weeks that hadn't tricked me. I remembered how a few days earlier some of the girls had gone out to hunt down a McDonald's and they'd succeeded. How was it? We had asked. One of them had shrugged, wrinkling her nose in distaste. The burgers were small. Only an American could be filled to the brim with delicious and usually nutritious, beautifully prepared Mediterranean cuisine, fresh veggies and pastas and olive oil and wine, and think, I want Coke, I want McDonald's. Where's the grease and the sugar? I want something nasty, something processed. I want my food to fucking kill me. And why not? It's a free country. The American story is one of freedom. Earlier that week, as our bus passed through a picturesque mountain pass, our assistant and expert on all things Greek told us about Uwgb Day, a day commemorating the Battle of Greece which had taken place in the area. On that day in 1940, the Greek Prime Minister resisted demands by Benito Mussolini to allow Axis forces to occupy Greek territory, sparking war. People of Greece took to the streets that morning, shouting Ohi, or no. Her voice was somber but warm with pride as she told us the story of her people fighting and dying for their freedom from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany long before her birth. Later, we drove to the location where the Battle of Marathon took place during the Greco-Persian Wars, where the massively outnumbered Greek army fought and defeated invading Persian forces almost 2,500 years prior to their resistance in World War II. The field is empty now, save for a massive burial mound where the Greeks had buried the ashes of their fallen soldiers. The Greek story, I think, is a story of freedom as well, the original perhaps upon which ours was written. I wondered why it warmed me more than the American version, why I felt more emotion over a foreign country's history of resistance than I ever did over the 4th of July. I wondered if perhaps our story wasn't one of freedom at all, but of unrestraint, of decadence, of personal comfort, of following in the footsteps of people like Christopher Columbus and Thomas Jefferson, who did as they pleased, damn the consequences. A story of freedom to rather than freedom from. In ancient Greece, the word eleutheria meant what liberty means to us today, more specifically the personification of liberty. Their liberty was a deity to be revered, not an abstract ideal. After the Roman Empire spread into Greece in 146 BC and adopted much of their culture, Eleutheria became the Roman goddess Libertas. From there, Latin libertas became French liberté, which became English liberty. And in the United States, liberty gained life again in Our Lady Liberty. Now on Liberty Island, the famous Statue of Liberty towers over New York Harbor in her Roman robes, holding her Roman tablet inscribed with Roman numerals, a pagan goddess guarding over American Christian land. She's now a renowned symbol of American freedom, ironically serving as a constant reminder of our Greco-Roman roots. One of many, as it turns out, democracy. The great American export was invented in Greece. Demokratia, an ancient Greek word that translates to rule by people, was invented and practiced by Athenians for the first time in 508 BC. Even the domes and columns of our government buildings are modeled after ancient Greek architecture. Whatever conception of liberty and freedom we have, it is not even ours. On my group's first morning waking up in Athens, we walked from our apartment to the college that was sponsoring us for our orientation, jet-lagged and easily distracted by a myriad of fascinating sights and sounds. Athens was, in pretty much every observable way, a typical big modern city, but it was also one of the oldest in the world, and you could see and almost feel the 3,400 years of recorded history weaved into the fast-paced modern landscape in a way that made it seem nothing at all like Madison or Chicago or New York City or anything within the borders of the United States. The Acropolis, the iconic citadel of Athens, stood tall and imposing on its hill, towering over the rest of the city, a near constant reminder on the horizon of what this place was, birthplace of Western civilization, of democracy, of so many things that my country thinks itself the center of in the current day. This is not a contemporary city dropped on top of the burnt and broken remains of a long-lost past. It developed organically, grown naturally, and maintained a deep connection to its roots. The ancient agora sits across the street from a line of restaurants and shops. Along one road, you can see Roman baths, Hadrian's Arch, the massive temple of Olympian Zeus. On the other side, a school, a hotel, a bank. The ubiquitous presence of the very distant past in Athens, right alongside signs of ongoing life, makes it impossible to forget, and perhaps that's the point. Perhaps our American cities that seem to have popped up from the ground, as if there's nothing but wilderness before them, disconnect us from our histories deliberately as Athenians hold so tightly to theirs, something that wants to be remembered versus something that begs to be forgotten. That morning, we were told that we were probably more likely to be catcalled or have our personal space invaded in Greece than we did back home. In the same breath, she told us it was illegal to carry any weapon on the streets, and that included pepper spray. I watched as two of the girls in the group quietly and uneasily tucked their mace-equipped keychains into their purses. Mine was already tucked away, and I made a mental note to put it back in my suitcase when we returned to the apartment. Noticing our discomfort with the idea of being unarmed catcall bait, the woman running our orientation smiled. Don't worry, they don't have guns. You will not get shot. I was reminded of the endless news stories in the US of women being shot and killed for rejecting the advances of men. Fair enough, I thought, but the implication was clear to me. You're also scared of these foreigners, but you're safer here with us than your home. Our right to bear arms is an oddity to anyone on the outside, something to look in on with morbid curiosity. It's a freedom that no one seems to envy, a freedom that costs us so many other freedoms and makes you question your understanding of the meaning of the word. I knew this, but did not feel any more comfortable walking the streets of Athens that day. There were moments like this when the magical veneer started to crack. She was right, of course. It was unlikely that I would be shot, particularly in comparison to my odds back home. However, swapping random shootings for random sexual harassment didn't feel like a trade-off I wanted to agree to, nor did I believe that that was an intellectually honest comparison. It was a lot simpler than that. I was more likely to be shot in the United States than Greece, and I was more likely to be sexually harassed in Greece than in the United States. There is no correlation. Less guns didn't necessarily mean more creepy men, and it is entirely possible to have less of both. Her impulse to defend her country at the expense of another felt too familiar to really take issue with, however. In the 8th grade, I took world history. That was the first time I saw a chip in that magical veneer of Greece built by popular culture. We spent a week on ancient Greece, a week I'd looked forward to all year, and just a couple of days on ancient Sparta. The badass, militaristic city-state of Greece had famously sacrificed 300 of its own to hold off the massive invading army from Persia, suddenly became a land of horrifying misery and brutality, one where babies were killed for being sickly, disabled, or female, where young girls were raped in their marriage beds. I also learned that while many cultures throughout history had some form of slavery, ancient Greece was one of the very, very few that relied so heavily on the slave trade that it would have been devastated without it, alongside the United States. I wondered if it was okay to celebrate what likely would not have been possible without the unjust suffering of so many people. Somehow I never thought to apply that same question to the United States until much later. Perhaps when I celebrated the 4th of July, I never thought much about what I was celebrating. I loved sitting barefoot and sleeveless out in the driveway, comfortably cooled by the summer's evening breeze, the crickets drowned out by both close and distant crackles and booms, the smoky air clearing out the mosquitoes. I loved the one summer night per year where the whole family would make an effort to gather, and I hated when someone could not. I rarely thought much of independence or of wars and victories. I rarely thought of the British, and I rarely thought of liberty. 4th of July came shortly after I returned home from Greece, and I revisited Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech for the first time in years. Douglass, the escaped slave who became a leader of the abolitionist movement, asked the very questions I never thought to. What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? African slavery in America began in 1513 and didn't end until 1865. Black Americans have not been free for even half as long as they spent enslaved. They've received no apology or reparations. We do not celebrate the date of their liberty. What to the Black American is our 4th of July? For Greece, I forgave quickly and easily. About a decade after my eye-opening world history class, when I walked the ancient road in Athens to Plato's Academy, or ventured up to the Temple of Apollo where the ancient people would have consulted the Oracle of Delphi, I was not haunted by thoughts of the slaves who may have accompanied them. It is hard, irresponsible even, to hold a culture several thousand years in the past to the same moral standards as one of just a couple hundred years ago. Ancient European slavery fell with the rise of Christianity, only to be carried across the Atlantic more than 1,000 years later on ships decorated with the crucifix. It seems the founding fathers used this ancient world as a stepping stone to creating their new one and then regressed it. There was no excuse. The magic of Greece faded rapidly over my time there. I was no less in love with it at the end, but the reality of it as a real and messy and imperfect place like any other had set in. I had frequent near-death experiences at the hands of drivers who had little respect for road laws. I lost several hours waiting for food in restaurants. I heard far more catcalls and inappropriate comments in my direction in 3 weeks than I'd heard in my entire life up until that point. I was no longer waiting for that visit from Apollo, all shining and divine, god of sun and music and poetry and all things lovely, when I finally visited the ruins of his temple in Delphi, where the oracle received and interpreted his messages for travels for thousands of years, many of which famously decided the fate of all Greece. I was overwhelmed and vulnerable on this trip, quick to tears, but I never cried so easily as I did at the top of that hill. I looked on at the ruins of that temple where so many countless destinies had been forged. And then out at the surrounding mountains, green and lush and sunlit and virtually untouched by any visible signs of modern life. And I cried. I did not see Apollo, but I could have sworn I felt some sort of lingering magic. I wonder how the story of Greece and the story of America can be presented so similarly, yet touch me so differently, how that calls into question the honesty of the American myth. Whatever disquiet I ever felt with the Greek story, whatever cracks and flaws I discovered, I never disconnected from the underlying mythos for long. Nothing can exist for 5,000 years without incurring a dent or two, and I can forgive it for that if what lies underneath the cracked exterior is still genuine, still holds its worth. I do not know if the United States has earned that forgiveness. If our short and immensely bloody history can be covered in gold paint and made new again. I often go back to Frederick Douglass's speech. There's not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Think of how much has happened since he wrote that, how much violence he could not have even known of yet. I wonder again if ours is a story of freedom. If not, then what? Indulgence? The story of instant gratification with no regards to tomorrow? I wonder if more than anything, ours is a story of self-destruction. The story of expecting English from foreign tongues, of colonization, of slavery, of million-dollar dreams and minimum wage realities, of the sugary sweet tooth rot of Coca-Cola. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sidney. That was great. All right, our next reader is Dr. Rebecca Meacham. Rebecca Meacham is the author of 2 award-winning fiction collections. Her writing has been set to music, translated into Polish, and carved into woodblocks and letterpressed by steamroller. Here at Uwgb, she directs the Writing and Applied Arts program, co-chairs English, and works with the brilliant staff of Sheepshead Review and the fabulous interns of the Teaching Press. She was a founding organizer of Green Bay's annual Untitled Town Book and Author Festival, where she once shared creme brulee with The Handmaid's Tale author Margaret Atwood and a puppet. Please welcome Rebecca Meacham.
Thank you. Not sure if I'm live yet. Hi, thank you. Okay, so today I have a couple of things I'd like to read for you, and they're kind of changing the tune a bit. So one will be a very short excerpt from what I think is a novel in progress. No one's heard it before, and we were encouraged to read stuff that was brand new and no one had heard before. So you lucky people get to hear this. And then the second piece I'll read is definitely done and I'm never touching it again. And I really like it. And that will be some nonfiction. So first, an excerpt from a novel that I'm just calling Mother Maim, as in maiming someone's self. And here we go. We'll see how this goes. November 1987. When our mother maimed herself, she sent along a note. Our grandmother handed it to me as my sister and I stood in the principal's doorway, turtling our backpacks, sweating in our winter coats and snow pants. We'd been diverted from recess and sent to the main office where, to our surprise, our grandmother stood holding a piece of paper, our mother's note. At the hospital, using her healthy, unmaimed hand, our mother had written a message to assure us that even though this was a change in plans, she was fine, that she was only going to be away a little while, and that we should go enjoy some ice cream with Mimi. Mimi is what we called our grandmother at her assistance, despite the fact that we weren't babies. In fact, that winter, we'd turned 9. Our grandmother looked freshly pressed as always, wearing bright lipstick and what she called slacks, with what she called stylish accessories. She was underdressed for the weather in the mountains where we lived. We hadn't seen her in a year. Now, here she was, 200 miles from Los Angeles, signing her name on the early pickup clipboard. Your mom is going to be all right. It's just a little scratch, she said. When she smiled, I saw lipstick on her teeth. She'd made herself up without a mirror, and that should have been a clue. She guided us out the school door into a parking spot marked handicapped, even though it was obvious that she was perfectly fine. Don't you worry, she said. Mimi cleaned up your house. I was confused. We had never seen Mimi clean up anything. In Los Angeles, she had a girl who dusted her dustless tables and scrubbed her pristine floors. Whenever we visited, we stayed at a hotel on Mimi's dime. We never spent a lot of time at Mimi's house, which suited us just fine because it was practically a museum. Our grandmother played the scheming matriarch on the longest running soap opera on TV. Her house was filled with what she called furnishings, though not enough, it seemed to us, since the floors were clear enough to skateboard, if Mimi would have let us. She would not have let us. Rows of antique plates rattled inside glass cases, ping, ping, whenever we galloped through her halls. So at first, we mistook her cleaning as an act of disproportionate kindness, a compensation for some horror that she would reveal later to us in the car. But she had nothing more to say. All we did was pile into her warm white Cadillac and maneuver through the snow-banked parking lots. Even though it was winter in the mountains, we stopped for ice cream, eating our scoops at a quiet table, answering her questions about school. Our grandmother's lipstick ringed her plastic spoon while we tried not to spill our sprinkles. Afterwards, we stopped by our house for a change of clothes. Our mother was staying at the hospital for a few nights, and once she looked around at the mess of our house, Mimi decided that we'd all stay instead at a swanky ski hotel. We called our mother from our home phone, and she sounded like herself, only more exhausted, which, to be honest, I didn't think was possible. Our house told us the rest. Because when you're not used to cleaning, if you've never mopped up a quart of milk dropped drunkenly, if you've never scrubbed the ketchup that explodes onto walls from a jar thrown at your head, you miss spots. You don't see the blood pooled under the kitchen counter reddening the linoleum. You don't understand how blood seeps into the finest cracks of cupboard doors. Blood waits to catch your eye. Outlining the buttons of a phone, soaking the wood grain, splattering a door frame, my sister and I saw it instantly. Our mother's blood was on the surface, in plain sight, for us to see, or to look right past, as always. Okay. So that's the first part of, I'm not entirely sure what, but it was interesting enough for me to kind of see if it would be a novel. So I was kind of excited about that. The second piece I'm going to read for you is entitled Feather Rousing. And it is a flash nonfiction piece, which means it's very small and nonfiction. I should just tell you that the occasion for this piece came from a collaboration between Right on Door County, which is a really cool writers group and organization in Door County, and the Midsummer Music Series, which I hope will resume again in Door County, which is a series of concerts that are played around in different locations during the summer. And so for that, I, as a writer, was paired with, I got a composer that I was supposed to write something sort of in honor of. And so I was assigned Charles Valentin Alcan, who I'd never heard of, who is a contemporary of Chopin. And that kind of crashed into some bird experiences that my family had. And so this is entitled Feather Rousing. As I read it, there are sections and they're numbered, so I'll read those numbers too. 1. In 1859, Charles Valentin Alcan writes a funeral march for a parrot. This piece is a reconciliation, he notes. Forgive he who commemorates a defunct parrot. He begs apology as singers wail in French, Polly want a cracker? He is famously obsessive. If he plays a piece poorly, he plays it again, despite the yawning of the crowds, the yearning of their bladders. His letters are embroidered with regret, his character serially self-stabbed, a tortured needlepoint. He waits behind doors for empty halls. He tests the maids with hidden clutter. He even frets the butter. His house is 2 separate apartments stacked on top of each other. When guest calls downstairs and he's above, the concierge states truthfully that nobody is home. Years ago, he and Chopin swirled among the frilled. Everyone split their sides, laughing, Chopin wrote. But by 1859, Chopin's dead, and Alcan wears black on the days he ventures out. He is mistaken for a cleric. So what are we to do with his new song, this lark, this elegy, yoking bird to bassoon? 2. My husband says a song is a song and not a person. I say a song is a song and a person. Songs are songs, he says. My husband teaches himself guitar. His side gig was once spinning records. But I played piano as a kid, so I know a song can be a battle so fierce it drove my father to part his corporate executive's hair into braids just to mimic mine. My father bet me he could learn my recital piece in one day. He practiced his hands to blisters. My mom judged our contest. I won. I know singing solo on stage opened a cello in my chest, forever swallowing my squeak of shyness. I know Hamilton beats like my mother's great heart and looks like my daughter's in summer nightgowns twirling in the cooling asphalt. I know the alto parts of masses. I know the ingenue's I Want songs. I know that A Certain Christmas Carol is the last song our high school's goalie sang before he shot himself in the head, that duets can power drives from Keystone to Key West. For years, I could not tell where my voice ended and someone else's began. Once, I learned about superflocks, clouds of birds a mile long that pivot, soar, and drop. They move in harmony. At that time, I hadn't been in a choir for 20 years. I wept with loneliness. That's what a song is, I tell my husband, a poet. But I fumble the metaphor. Besides, doesn't everyone and their mother compare music to birds? 3. Alcan, too, left listeners dumbstruck. One wrote, I could not begin to describe where the melody, penetrating the mystery of death itself, climbs up to a blaze of light. But when Alcan went into seclusion, tongues began to wag. He sired a secret son, they twittered. The married mother was his student. Alcan tutored his son until the young man could tour theaters. Perhaps one afternoon in 1859, hands together on the keys, father and son noodled through notions of feathered funerals. Perhaps they pursed their lips in prim pretense. Perhaps this is why, 11 years later, as Germans invaded, Alcan's son fled Paris with 121 cockatoos. 4. The notes of Alcan's trio in G minor flutter like birds fluffing their feathers, feather rousing, the falconers call it, like the cardinal couple in our garden tending to their nest. The flame-red father and muted mother swoop and hop through grass. Wisconsin in June is the greenest green there is, lush where days before kids sledded in their front yards. My family matches eggshells to, can you see the babies? We Google and gasp because no matter the splendor of their fathers, baby birds look hideous, like something Mother Nature sneezed. In a day, our hatchlings' heads poke up. Next, they've perched. This is why I'm now inspecting what seems like an empty nest. It isn't. A fledgling screams and springs and falls feebly to earth and runs. Don't fear me, come near me, here, I call. The rumpled fledgling stares. Of course, as a human, I know best. I twice return it to the nest. It twice defies my earnestness. It stumbles over open lawns towards steady parent songs. Forgive me, fledgling, I say, exiling myself from your world. I regret causing your funeral. 5. Sometimes our rescues come with wings. Once, my husband carried an injured owl from road to rehab center. Once, we trapped a bat in a cup and freed it into midnight. Will our young cardinal thrive or die? I tell the story as a joke, yet I so regret to hope with 1,000 beaking stabs. Sometimes our rescues are songs, court and spark, heart and soul, thriller. You are the sunshine of my life. Today my husband texts, the baby cardinals are alive and well, red and gray and flying. All of Alcan's music is, some say, a reconciliation. So, a song is and is not a person. A song is also a bird. Wait, I'll make it better. A song is a fledgling caged in your hands, bone and feather, skin and talon, unnested, unwieldy, like a note sent between people in love, like guideposts in our blind spots, bridging presence and absence, grief and hilarity, a tiny immensity, poised for release, ready to rouse. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Meacham. That was awesome. Our final reader tonight is Rachel Sankey. Rachel Sankey is a senior earning her BFA in Writing and Applied Arts, as well as creative writing at UW Green Bay. She's worked with literary journals for the last 4 years and is currently the managing editor of Sheepshead Review. Rachel is very poetry-oriented and has spent several semesters working on mastering her craft. Her work is heavily inspired by poets like Frank O'Hara and Zachary Schomburg. She plans to graduate in the fall of 2021. Please welcome Rachel Sankey.
Hi, so I'm going to be reading 6 shorter poetry pieces. The first 3 that I read are pieces that I've pretty much finished up and are like final pieces, and then the second half of the 3 pieces that I read are very much so still works in progress. So this first piece is titled Inside the Elevator. I get on the elevator and you get on the elevator. We don't know each other. I hit the button for the 12th floor, and you hit every single button for every single floor. It's grueling, and you take forever. Too many push buttons. The elevator breaks down, and we're trapped. We have no choice but to fall in love in the confines of the small box suspended in air. Eventually, we get hungry. We feed off each other's hearts, and the rest of our flesh decomposes. It's getting harder and harder to breathe. You ask, "Do you still love me?" And I pretend that I can't hear you since both my ears have fallen off. Someone finally fixes the elevator and I reach the 12th floor. When the door opens, I walk out with only the remains of my skeletal structure. I don't look back. My next piece is titled In Late December. I was 15 when the world decided I'd still be alive and you wouldn't. That was the day all lights dimmed and went foggy, like streetlights in the rain at 3 a.m. The only time they became bright again was when I found you in my subconscious late at night. You became my nightmare, appearing in my bathroom, poker-faced, unmoving. I called out to you, but my voice sounded so far away, like it was drowning. I blinked the brightness out of my eyes and watched yours turn black. Your mouth gaped open like it couldn't support itself. I couldn't tell if it was you or me that started screaming. You began to dissolve into a black puddle on the floor. I wanted to reach out, to grab you, to save you, but I stood as if frozen in a block of ice. Maybe if I would have had the strength to reach out, the darkness would have sucked me back into the river where you spent your last moments. The December water would numb our skin and fill our cavernous mouths, the black and starry sky, our last image. We'd only have to wait a few hours for Dad to find us coasting near the bank, cold and lifeless. Thank you. The third piece that I have that's like completely finished is titled A Silent Baptism. I tried to squeeze myself into the tiny hole I found in my $15 New York sweatshirt from Penn to become a new woman. I tried so hard to be bathed in the dirty puddles around the streets of Times Square, dressed in a robe made of others' trash and adorned in a crown of rats. I kept lying to myself that this was the way and this was the place to be reborn. But the truth behind my baptism is that it was initiated in the stolen moment between me and you. On the train ride into the city, warm to-go cups of coffee in our hands, we each shared an earbud and listened to the music that made the 1,100-mile distance feel like you were in the same room with me. I remember watching out the giant and smudged window as the city came into view, the Empire State Building becoming much larger than a figurine, and yet all I wanted to do was sit with you on that dirty train full of strangers and watch city line after city line pass us by. Listen to the same songs over and over and over until they had flushed out all the bad parts of myself, and you could sit quietly next to me and watch my rebirth strike. And then the next 3 poems are the ones that are all works in progress right now. So this one is called, it will get a new title eventually, but right now it's American Dream Meets the Underworld. Brush your lips across my ear and tell me that I am your American dream. That we don't need 2.5 kids and 9-to-5 corporate prisons that will make our time on Earth feel more like a Greek mythology fever dream. Floating through the foggy haze in Asphodel, hoping that we did enough for daddy capitalism to make it to the aimless fields of Elysium, just to remain with the ache of feeling incomplete. Purgatory should be left for the dead, not the living. So tonight, Let's forget about our crippling credit card debt and the anxious thoughts of never retiring, and instead, play some Frank on the stereo in our overpriced New York tin can apartment. We will dance slowly in the kitchen and let the freshly wounded pomegranate bleed droplets onto the floor and stain it red. And you will kiss me as though we're falling to the underworld. Let America's Hades have mercy on us. Thank you. This next one, I think I've actually only read to Chris, so this is the first time that other people are reading it, and the working title for this one right now is just Footsteps. Only one pair of footsteps enter the grocery store tonight, and it feels foreign without her. This place is her forte and not mine, and I can see her ghost walking through the aisles with a pop in her step. She was happiest whenever she was around food. I'd watch her, grocery basket in hand, as she'd gaze at all the different pasta shapes, as if she were a child at an aquarium trying to decipher which fish is which. She'd go off on a tangent about how spaghetti is better for oil-based sauces, and that's why we needed fettuccine instead, because fettuccine does a better job at holding cream-based sauces, like the homemade Alfredo we made that night. And she'd waltz over to the cheeses and pick out the shredded Parmesan, toss it into the basket, and then step up on her tiptoes to kiss me, and then back to the ground shopping, as if all by natural instinct. And it makes me feel like I was always supposed to be a part of her life, and this was always supposed to be a part of our life. Her roaming aisles full of bread, fruits, meats, and me just 2 steps behind, taking all of her in. She can make the worst meal, which she's not capable of doing, and I would eat it over and over, just to be able to look at her from across the table. Tonight, I roam the aisles alone. I'll go home to attempt to make a grand dinner by myself, and I'll wait for the second pair of footsteps to come through the front door. My final piece is titled Gymnopédie. A black cushioned stool glowing softly in the pale light of morning, the air particles being filtered through specks of sun sneaking in through your curtains. An outstretched hand gestures to take a seat in front of the catalyst of a moment soon to be experienced. The shell of your soul sits behind me, places hands on keys, strikes down with fingertips, shows wisdom to the beginning of melodic lullaby, the room giving birth to tension expected, skin to skin and skin to key fighting for dominance. Warmth guides nimble and curious fingers to their correct positions, the room growing silent and focusing only on your breathing in the crook of my ear and the chills up my spine. And begin. Tension releases and dissipates into strands around the room, meets music, meets intimacy, meets bliss. Pride greets vulnerability and shows what it's like to be crescendo and decrescendo, to be in love with the notes and the woman in front of you, to be part human, part ethereal. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That was great. I really loved it. And thanks so much, all of you. This was a really wonderful reading, and it was so lovely to get to hear you all read. So I think we have opened up the Q&A, which means that you should be able to type your questions here, and we will ask them to our readers and give them a chance to talk about things that interest them in relationship to writing or reading, those kind of things. So as you're taking a minute to do that, I will just add that we are always looking for faculty and student readers to participate in this reading series. So if this is something that you out there dream of maybe doing, that could be a reality. Just reach out to me or to Dr. Williams, and we will do our best to add you to our lineup. All right. See any questions out there? All right, I might start and just ask a question. I know that's some power that I have as the MC, but I will just take it. So I was hoping that you could all talk to me a little bit about things that you feel like have influenced you as a writer or an artist. So it can be things like books or music or authors or games or just anything that you feel like has spoken to you and to your writing. Curious to hear a little bit about that.
Oh, sorry. My bad. So, I guess some of my favorite things that inspire me to write, as you can tell by some of the pieces that I spoke tonight, is a lot about like my heritage, and kind of my family tree. I base a lot of my poems around family dynamics, so a lot of the things that I write about have happened in my family or just family relationships in general. But I really just enjoy like listening to classical music and just kind of writing whatever I feel, even if it's really terrible, and then just kind of going back and editing it and making it a little bit more concise. So yeah. Sorry, I didn't realize the live was on me.
Yeah, so I'm obviously really inspired by history. So I'm a history student, and pretty much whenever I'm in class, I'm thinking about, things I can write. Most of my nonfiction has something to do with history. Like I like connecting it to stuff going on now. And even when I write poetry or fiction, it's usually historically based. So I get like so much inspiration from classes or even just historical stuff I read on my own, things like that. I just feel like there's so much to say about these things that is relevant to us today, while still having like respect for, the past and all that kind of thing.
Sorry, I have to unmute. Hi. This is hard because I'm a creative writing and English professor, so it's like I have to figure out how to write, like say like two things. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. So this is hard because I'm like a creative writing professor and I have so much stuff that has inspired me throughout the entire course of my life. So I'll try to keep it short. I think overall, like I'm really interested in history and I'm interested in stories that haven't been told or stories that are on the margins, even if it's a really sort of popular, well-known, powerful type thing. I've been inspired by, for example, hearing about a princess in 1848 in Germany who thought that she swallowed a glass piano. And I was like, well, all right. I want to know more about what that. So I imagine I did a flash fiction piece that was like based on that. And so but what was interesting and very consistent from that perspective is she's really marginalized. Like she's the least power of anyone in that entire like place where she lives. And all of this stuff is going on with revolution and so forth. So that interests me. I like that kind of thing. And also just kind of, I hear lines. So the when my mother maimed herself, she sent along a note. That was a line that popped into my head. Based in reality, I had a tragic avocado pitting accident and like had tried to pit an avocado and it didn't go very well and had to get stitches and surgery and all this crazy stuff. And in order to appease my kids that I was worried if, their Nana came and got them and it wasn't me and they were really little, I made a little video at the hospital like, Mom's okay. And so I was thinking, well, what would happen if that happened in a house that's nothing like mine, where things are very dangerous and fraught? So sometimes a line like that will lead me into like, well, how would that fit in? Where would that be? So that's the kind of stuff that inspires me.
So like it kind of in my bio, I mentioned that a lot of my work is inspired by Frank O'Hara and Zachary Schomburg. And Schomburg is a surrealist poet. And when I discovered him last semester, a lot of his work made me, like he was really good at describing something I wasn't able to describe myself, but had very similar feelings to, that kind of like almost dreamlike trance. And then Frank O'Hara is very much like a stream of consciousness poet and kind of writes about whatever he's thinking about and almost, to me, romanticizes it in some way. So I definitely get inspiration from that. But a lot of my inspiration just comes from like specific moments in time that I've experienced or imagined someone experiencing. And I've been doing that since I was really young and first started writing poetry. And I experience a moment and then I typically want to grab onto it and flesh it out because times like those are so ephemeral and I want to make them just like a little bit more concrete.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much. So we have another question from Kim that is, what methods do you use or how do you navigate away from the oh so cruel villain called writer's block?
So how I usually deal with writer's block is, I don't know if this is good advice, but sometimes I kind of just take a break from writing and I just kind of let the words come to me. Professor Meacham brought up a really great point of like sometimes how a line will pop into her head. And usually when I'm taking a break from writing or I'm just really frustrated that a piece isn't going the way that I want it to go, I'll take a break. And then usually it's at night where I'm like just about to fall asleep and just something pops into my head, like a word or a line. And I'm like, okay, it's no longer there. And then that's usually what helps. But I find a lot of inspiration from other writers. Typically, if I'm having a really hard time, I'll just open a book of poetry and just read something and just see if there's an idea or a word or a concept that's being talked about that I can find inspiration from. And if not, then I just take a break.
So most important thing to me when I feel like I'm having writer's block is to not continue to try writing, because I feel like that just makes it worse and worse. But sort of similar to what Lydia was saying, I read when I'm feeling like I need more inspiration, which I feel like sometimes I'm worried about doing, so I'm worried about like copying something, which is silly, but I feel like that's the best way to get, sort of ideas going, or even listening to music, anything sort of engaging in anything sort of artistic like that, just sort of gets that part of my brain going. But yeah, for me, the main thing is just like, if I continue trying to write and just trying to push through it, it just makes it so much worse.
So what you heard me read were escapes from writer's block, because my big project is this novel set in the backdrop of the Peshtigo fire. It's set in 1871. And I don't know what I'm doing, like, at all. And it's really hard. And so I go and I'm like, I'll write a flash thing, or I'll start my other novel. And that's, that feels new, and I love new things. And I'm really great at like the first section falling out, and then I have no idea what to do for years and years and years, and it's really hard. So I will share something that I've used when I'm trying to actually make words and within that novel, which blocks me everywhere I go, because it's really hard to hear how people would speak in 1871. Like, I have no idea like what that actually sounds like when people are courting or trying to get together or whatever. So one day I was like, I have to do something, and I set my writing students know I have like tiny little hoops, like make a little hoop, jump through it. You're the little goal, write 100 words, just get it done. And so I had nothing. I didn't know what to do. So I sat down and I started with a dream that I'd had, because I'm like that. And I just sat down and I was like, I had this dream where everything was kind of like at the seashore or at something, and it was really salty. And there was a lot of salt in this dream, which has nothing to do with 1871, Peshtigo, Wisconsin, or a fire. I just need to say there couldn't be almost anything farther from what I was doing. But I sat down and I just wrote out stuff, and I just did some association with that, like salt, everything's encrusted. Salt's encrusting things. People can't move. People feel frozen. People feel stagnant. And that got to the emotional place where my like teenage girl who works in the local shop and is sick of all these men in her town, like I got to her mindset just from doing something really outside and kind of plunking away and associating with imagery from that. So those are sometimes my way in. It's like, all right, what's on my mind? How am I feeling? And then I try to build that out to words that could be used in something that seems nothing like it.
So for me, mine's pretty similar to Lydia and Sidney's advice, but I kind of like handle writer's block in two parts. When I start to feel like I don't have any inspiration to go off of, I will read other people's poetry. I have a couple poetry books laying around at home, or I've read a lot of my classmates' poetry this semester because it's really, like, all their work has really interested me also. But when I can tell that that's not really helping and I get frustrated, I don't touch my work, and I don't touch other poetry or other like forms of writing, and instead I consume different forms of art. A lot of time that tends to be music and like specific songs that I know are really good at making me feel something and almost like making me feel what I want to write, if that makes sense. And also consuming like different forms of art like painting, or a couple weeks ago I went to a sculpture museum outside, and being able to enjoy art basically without feeling the pressure to create my own stuff. And then when it comes back to me, I feel a lot more refreshed about it.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a question and a comment from Heidi Sherman. Heidi writes, "Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. Could you talk about the revision process? How do you decide when you're done with each work?"
That's a great question that I really struggle to answer, because I guess in my opinion, like, a piece of work can never necessarily be done. I guess sometimes it's almost kind of like a gut feeling that I get, where I'm really like confident with the piece, and for me, like specifically with poetry, like every line, every stanza, every word is what I want it to be, and it's conveying the meaning that I want it to have, and stuff like that. But as I've learned through Professor Williams' class, I don't know if you can ever be done with revision. You know, and we also just talked about, like, we had a whole class on the line, and it kind of made me realize, oh my gosh, like I could change every poem and it could be completely different. So I guess it's just sometimes like a feeling that you have within yourself, or maybe you're just really tired of the piece. That's usually what I do, and then I just kind of like take a break, and then I come back to it, and then I guess if I still feel confident with it, then I guess I can consider it done. Or if it doesn't, then it needs revision. And sorry about my cat, but yeah.
So this is also a really hard question for me, because I rarely feel finished with anything that I write. So like the piece I read tonight, I wrote it back in 2019. At the time, considered it done, and then when I dug it back out to prepare for tonight, I was rereading it. I was like, oh, like I was cringing at like every other paragraph. So I did more editing. So I feel like things can feel done when I feel like, okay, there's no more changes I want to make, and then, you know, when you revisit it later, you'll find something new. And to me, it's frustrating, but it's also a good thing, because to me, it's like, okay, I've grown as a writer since I wrote that, which is a good thing. But yeah, I think it basically, as bad as this sounds, comes down to, I'm frustrated with working on it. I don't feel like I know how to make it any better. And that's kind of where I feel like, okay, then it's finished for now.
For me, it's kind of just a more optimistic, cheerful vision of what Sidney just shared, and kind of what Lydia is saying, and that is, I can't think of anything else to do with it, but it feels good. It feels done, and there's stories. I don't remember if it's Maya Angelou or if it's a number of writers who will have their books published on bookshelves, and they'll go into the bookstore and they'll go in and they'll change lines, right? It's already out there. It's a published thing. People can buy it, and they'll be like, and they'll do that. And I am not that person. If it makes it into publication and I feel good about it, I don't worry about it anymore. I don't return to it. That said, my first collection is ancient by this point. It was published in 2004. And when I look back at those stories, there are definitely some things I see that I might have done differently, but they're done for what they needed to be. I'm satisfied, but and I'm not going to go into bookstore. First of all, I don't even know if you can find it, but like I'm not going to go and like change anything in it because it's not bothering me. In a way, it's kind of just like looking at a picture of yourself in like middle school and being like, oh, weren't you cute, right? And there's a sort of affection, and it's not mean, but it's not who I am anymore as a writer. But I don't want to do anything about it. I don't need to wear braces anymore. I don't need to like go back and enter into that world again. So that's how I know.
Well, I hate the revision process, actually. It's always really rough for me. It's gotten easier over time as I've taken more poetry classes because not only am I forced to revise, but I'm given really good critiques both from my professors and fellow classmates, and it almost makes me, even though I said I hated it, it makes me a little bit excited to go back and revise because they also see potential in my work. But I completely agree with both Lydia and Sidney. I don't really know if a piece is ever considered finished for me. There are definitely pieces that I've revised and have become really attached to, and I know that they're finished. For example, the poetry piece I read in late December, I'm like, I feel really good about this and I don't want to change it because I think it's going to change what I meant. But then the poem I read before that, Inside the Elevator, when I went back to it today, that's a piece I wrote last semester. I was like, I could have added more, and I definitely like finished it last semester. I was like, no, this is good, and now I can see that there's more stuff I needed to add. So, and again, that's kind of what Sidney said about growth. I think it's just like a constant process of evolving, but that doesn't necessarily mean you always have to revise your work either, because that's showing like the different stages you were at in your writing life. So
Thanks, everyone. Looks like we have 2 more questions. So this one is from Mary, who writes, "This was wonderful. I want to reread your words and reflect upon them, but actually listening to each of you was more powerful than reading your words. As writers, what do you prefer, a listening audience or people reading your words?" And I guess you could even take that further and think about audience in general. Like, how do you imagine your audience? Thanks.
I think it's kind of, I don't know, like a combination of both, because this is my first time ever speaking at an event. I've only just recently had to speak my poetry for Professor Williams' class, which I really ended up not. It's a little bit different. So for me, it's like I've only really had people just read my work, which I like because I think like you get to read it with your own voice and the reader has like their own interpretation, which I think is really fun because it's always nice to have people read your work and then come up with what they think it's about. But I guess like, especially tonight, it was fun because people got to hear how I read it in my head, which I think is really unique. And it kind of gives you some independence too. So I guess kind of a mixture of both, but I guess I would enjoy it more if people would read my work because I don't really like speaking a lot. So, yeah.
So I've sort of struggled with speaking a little bit. I feel like I'm not a very expressive reader. I feel like if maybe I was, I'd prefer to have people listen to me reading out loud. But I'm also not a poet, and I feel like, poetry and things like that sort of benefit more from having it spoken. And I feel like there's a sort of meaning that you can get across with anything that you've written by reading it aloud, if you're skilled at that. So it's something that I hope to get better at, because I do think that there's a sort of different experience to it that I don't think you can get by just reading someone's work.
I like both. I since I hear so much of what I'm very like language driven as a prose writer, and so I read things out loud a lot as I'm writing them, and so I like to imagine how people are reading that on the page. So that's very much in my head. But I love, as I've gotten older, I love reading stuff. I absolutely love it. Like, it makes me super happy. And there are times when I've like sung stuff that were literally things I had that were songs in stories, and just, I don't know, it's more fun than I actually thought. I like to be a lively reader. And there have been times too where, based on one time I was teaching Beloved, which is amazing, by Toni Morrison. Everyone should read it. But I had a whole class of lit students read. There's a whole part where everything's really kind of breaking down, and I am beloved and she is mine, and and there's a bunch of voices, you can't tell who is who. In each line, you're not sure who's speaking. Is it the daughter? Is it the other daughter? Is it the mother? And I had the class take these different lines, and I thought, wow, that's really powerful to hear how that sounds with a bunch of voices. So I've actually given parts out in some of my readings and had different people read different parts as I'm reading to kind of create, especially if it's a communal piece. I had a flash piece that was written like as a primer, set in an Indian boarding school, and these girls are like plotting their escape. So I had different people during the reading kind of reading, and then at the end we all read together the same lines, and that was really fun. So I don't know, I've grown as a reader, and I like almost staging them. Like, I almost like going right before being really annoying. Like I like right before that point, I like bringing people in as much as I can.
I would also have to say both. I think it depends. I like being able to have my own voice in the piece when I'm reading, and I've been lucky enough to have a lot of experiences with reading my work out loud, just because my high school used to have like premiere nights, and we would be able to read our poetry, and we did open mic night. So I've had a lot of well, not recently, but I used to have a lot of practice with reading out loud. But I feel when it comes to the only thing that kind of, I guess, takes away from the piece when you read out loud is that if you're not sharing the screen, you can't see the form that the poem's written in. So, and there are certain pieces that, like, I've written in a certain form on purpose to be read that way. And if I read it out loud, the reader's not going to know that. For example, again, in late December is a prose piece, but no one would have known that if I wouldn't have shown you. So I'm definitely in between with both. It's exciting and rewarding to read out loud, but I almost sometimes think it's just as rewarding to have someone read it themselves.
All right, so I think we're running low on time, and this is gonna have to be our last question. We still have two in the list, so I'm gonna combine them. We'll see how that goes. So one question from Anonymous is, do you like to listen to music while writing? And if you do, what are your favorite genres, or who are your favorite artists? And then the second question from Kim says, do you have any advice for creatives who love their craft but struggle when it comes to sharing it with others? And what helps you / how do you build up confidence to do so? Maybe just advice in general for all of the writers out there that would like to do what you do.
So in regards to music, I tend to listen to music that, like, classical music or instrumental music. Sometimes I'll listen to music if there's lyrics in it, but it has to be very specific. I'm not gonna whip out, indie rock and just be like, yeah, I'm really in my feels, unless that song is catered to that. But I feel like instrumental music is a lot better, because it can still convey feelings without speaking. And then I guess when it comes to, like, sharing your work with other people, other writers, this is something that I struggle with, because it's hard, because your work is kind of like your baby, and you don't want anyone to say that your baby is ugly or it's not good. And so for me, like, that's kind of the hardest thing that I struggle with. But what I've learned from, like, a bunch of revisions through, like, my peers and professors is that you want feedback. If someone tells you that your piece is phenomenal, then maybe sometimes that's really good, but I always think that there's things that you can change, and learning to use that as constructive criticism to make your work even better I think is really helpful. And so now, like, when I ask people for advice or when I'm sharing work, like, I do want them to tell me like what they would change or what seems a little off, because it's only making my work stronger. But you don't always have to take that advice and run with it. It's good to have like your own opinions about your piece too. But I tend to see if like people are bringing up the same comments, then it's something to look at. That was kind of a mixed answer. Yeah.
So for the music question, I really cannot listen to any music when I'm writing. I have to be like laser focused or I will not get anything done. I do listen to music, like I said before, to sort of get out of, writer's block and sort of inspire myself. And I find that instrumental music is really good for that. Video game soundtracks, stuff like that. It's just good for sort of, setting a mood without getting, extra words in your head that you don't want because you're writing. And then for the second question, I also still struggle a lot with sharing my work, even though I'm a senior creative writing student. But I find that it's something, like Lydia said, it's like super important. My work improved so much once I was able to get feedback from other people. And that's then you gain in confidence because other people have looked at this and I'm sort of taking other people's thoughts into consideration. But a way to sort of, I think, build up to that if you're uncomfortable with it is showing your work to people who aren't writers, people who don't know much about writing, because then you can sort of get that sort of casual audience feedback, which is often less critical, but so that can be a good confidence booster sometimes, I think. But also I feel like it's less nerve-wracking than sharing with people that you feel like are way better writers than you, even though they may not be.
Okay, so for music, that's the easier answer. Like Sidney, I don't always listen to stuff. If I really, I don't know, sometimes it can interfere, especially with fiction. But I will say that in working on this novel set in 1871 Wisconsin, I've tried to get to moods of the characters. And so I put out a thing on Facebook once, a question what's good lumber baron music? I'm writing a lumber baron and what is that? So, and people were like, you should listen to The Planets or whatever. It's some famous orchestral piece that I'm kind of blanking out on, but it was very stirring and powerful and manly. And so that's, and even when I'm trying to write My Shopkeeper's Daughter, I made a song list called Yearning, and it's all the songs that made me all angsty and wanting to get when I was 15, right? So Howard Jones, go way back, The Cure. So those kinds of things, just so I can get in that mood. But sometimes I don't. A lot of, there are times when it's just I can't hear anything. I just have to hear the words that I'm trying to make. In terms of sharing work, so here's where it all comes out. I'm terrible. I teach workshop, literally invent workshops. I hate sharing my work before it's done. I went through MFA program, PhD program, had all kinds of workshops I had to take for credit. Really hated it the whole time, mainly because I only wanted to hear how wonderful I was. And so it was just awful. And so, and then the workshop would be like, well, this is wonderful. And then the professor would be the one that's like, you got a lot of work to do. And I'm like, but I want to go with what they said because that's easier for me. So I always have had a very bad relationship with that. Currently, I will seek input for things I don't have any idea how to do. And right now that's nonfiction. And I'm writing more in nonfiction. And I feel like I'm flailing around. I haven't read a ton of the kind of thing I want to write. So I'm more likely to reach out to people in genres I feel very like I can't figure out what to do or how to solve problems. But yes, here it all comes out. I'm so bad at being in a workshop. Nobody, even my husband didn't see my first book until it was in galleys, and I let him see it for grammar. I'm like, okay, all you get to do is look at what's wrong with the grammar. That was it. That was just awful. So I'm very bad at it.
Okay, so I actually have a really different response to the kind of music I listen to than everybody else. There are, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I do listen to some instrumental music sometimes, but not as often. I tend to listen to a lot of artists that make me feel a certain type of way. Kind of, I don't know if this will make sense, but I'm very much someone who wants to travel and have that experience where like standing over and like there's just like mountains or canyons behind you. And so I listen to a lot of people who get, a lot of artists who get at the heart of that. So folk artists like Gregory Alan Isakov, The Head and the Heart, and where it also, the melody's good, but also it feels like no word is wasted in their lyrics. And I typically don't blast it, it's soft in the background, but it really helps me to get into that mindset because those are the songs that kind of make me feel most alive, and I would prefer to feel most alive when I'm writing. But as for advice about sharing work, it's definitely scary, but I would say if it's something that you're nervous about, like going to your close friends about it first. And getting advice from them. If you're lucky enough, like for me and Lydia and a few of our other friends, we're all in the same poetry class together. So I'm getting critique all the time from all of my friends, which has been really helpful because, not saying that someone who wasn't my friend who critiqued my work wouldn't be honest, but I know that they all have their best intentions in mind when it comes to helping me become better. And that's also going to help you, kind of like Sidney said, build up your confidence a little bit. I'm definitely a little more confident when I share my work now than I was before. And it's also helped me to write certain kinds of things that I was scared to write about before. And now I'm like, you know what? I've been wanting to write like this, and it's nothing like what I look like or seem like as a person, but I'm going to do it now because they've seen my work and they know I'm capable and I'm capable of doing this. And even if it turns out like crap, at least I tried, and I know that's not the thing for me, but yeah, I hope that made sense.
All right, I think that is our program for this evening. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. It was really lovely to have all of you here and to have such lovely questions. And thanks also to our fabulous readers, Lydia Downey, Sidney Grady, Rebecca Meacham, and Rachel Sankey. Really loved hearing you talk about your work and about writing and sharing your stuff with all of us. So thank you all. I guess that's it for us. I hope you all have a good rest of the week, and we'll see you at our next event.